he is a senior ethics fellow for the Project on Government Oversight. That's right. His work did not stop when he left the White House. It is a nonpartisan, independent watchdog that investigates and exposes waste, corruption, abuse of power, and when the government fails to serve the public or silences those who report wrongdoing. Before that, Walter served for 4 years as the director of the U.S. Office of Government Ethics under Obama, and then resigned, as I just explained, and we will find out so much more. But let's just give him a warm welcome. You guys, put your hands together for Mr. Walter Shaub.
Wow, I can hear the applause from the future.
I know, it's amazing, right? It's just deafening.
Tenet thing here.
Oh my God. Thank you so much for being on the show.
Yeah, happy to be here.
I feel like the reason that I've been really attracted to your work and your writing and your Twitter feed is because you kind of, and I mean this with all due respect, don't give any fucks. And that's exactly what we need right now in a time where, you know, our democracy is very much on the ropes and the people in power don't seem like they're taking this fight seriously. And someone who's been on the inside and is just like calling things for what they are. No matter who's in power. So I just hats off to you.
Thanks.
And your inability to put down Twitter, Walter. No, but I want to ask you because, you know, I actually found out that there was an Office of Government Ethics because of you. And it like blew my mind that this thing even existed. Obviously, maybe I'm just slow. Maybe I didn't know. But what did the Office of Government Ethics do? What does it do? And yeah, what were you doing up until the point where you left?
You know, I worked there a long time before I was the director. And one of the things I said in my confirmation hearing that I wanted to do was get people more familiar with the Office of Government Ethics, to reassure people we were in there doing something. I did not expect that would come true in the way that it did. You know, we practically stood on a street corner with signs saying we exist, trying to engage with the public. And we were really excited that we'd gotten up to like 500 Twitter followers. And then in a period of 5 months, we jumped to like 55,000 for all the wrong reasons, or maybe all the right reasons, because the public kept sending cards and messages saying, keep up the fight, hold them accountable. You know, the Office of Government Ethics, the name is something of a cruel joke because the agency was created in the wake of the Watergate scandal. So here we find ourselves 40 years ago encountering similar problems, though not nearly as bad as now. And Congress responded by passing an ethics law, one that the president at the time, Jimmy Carter, championed, even though it had some personal inconvenience for him.
Right.
They created the Office of Government Ethics, and I think the name was lofty and was intended to inspire an ethical culture. And amusingly, OGE had a file full of articles around the time where all these people in Washington were claiming it was going to destroy government to have the morality police running around and keeping them honest, and they'd never be able to recruit anybody. Well, Congress never really gave OGE much power. And when it started in 1979, it only had about 20 people, and it never grew more than 100 and then shrunk back down to about 75 people. But its mission is very narrow. It resolves financial conflicts of interest in the executive branch, especially with the top leaders like Senate confirmed appointees. And it oversees agency ethics officials that it doesn't directly supervise, but it writes the regulations for their work and then audits it. So there's about 4,500 agency ethics officials scattered through a government of 2.1 million civilian federal employees. And they're really good at what they do. It's just that what they do is so limited, it can't meet the challenge of a truly corrupt presidency. I think it worked fairly well for about 4 decades, creating a culture where people valued avoiding conflicts of interest. It didn't get into other things that we might consider ethics. You know, it's unethical, that we're destroying the environment and we're all going to live on a either frozen wasteland or burning cauldron of whatever. Um, but
That's
uh,
beyond the scope.
but that's really beyond the scope. And so it focused on financial conflicts of interest. Um, and I think in retrospect, it's weaker. We knew it was weak at the time, but it was so much weaker than we ever thought it was. And
Right.
I think what Trump did was expose the weaknesses, not create them,
Mm.
or
Yeah.
exploit them, rather.
And exploit them. No, that's I mean, in so many different areas. But I mean, it's interesting because it kind of reminds me of like a almost like a bearing witness human rights model. You know,
Yeah.
like it's important to bear witness for sure. But sometimes human rights groups are like also really toothless. They're just like, this is happening, you know. Anyway,
Yeah.
let's let's keep going. And you're just like, wait a minute. But you guys are like the better angels. The people are like, hey, yeah, no, I realize I could do that, but I'm not going to. um I guess before we talk about the Trump administration, I did want to ask you about, you know, I'm floored because I look at someone like former Vice President Dick Cheney, who was invested in Halliburton and then, you know, helped spearhead the drive to invade Iraq.
Yeah.
And Halliburton won big time in terms of private no bid contracts and things like that. So, you know, and I don't, again, maybe he was divested enough from the company. But I mean, to say that he was not raking it in from that is ridiculous. So, how did it? Do you feel like it wasn't working back then, and it was just even more egregious under Trump? How poorly it functioned?
Yes and yes. Both are true. One of the most clever things the people in Washington who are really opposed to a truly ethical government on both sides of the aisle have done is they've played a sleight of hand where it focuses our attention in the wrong place. And so take a look at Dick Cheney, for instance. It was before my time, so I'm piecing this together from
Right.
news reports, but he was allowed to keep stock options in Halliburton. And when he sold them, he gave all of the profits to charity. So he didn't personally profit. And there was a model for that when Ronald Reagan did the same thing with his movie royalties. He donated them to charity while he
Mm.
was in government. Uh, so that isn't the primary conflict of interest. The primary conflict of interest is that this is a guy who came from Halliburton and was deeply loyal to a government contractor culture, and then participated in one of the greatest lies in our history and caused hundreds of thousands of deaths as a result, including some American deaths,
Oh yeah.
although far fewer. So I think one of the problems with government ethics is that we define it too narrowly. And then I think the things it focuses on are important, but I think they distract us sometimes from other things that are also important.
Hmm. Tell me about then those early days, and the dude who completely revealed that even as narrow as OGE was, it was like, well, this cannot stand.
Yeah.
You know, and what things were like under Trump and what you were initially flagging. It's hard for us to think back to those first days, but what were those red flags?
So, I knew what I was getting into in the pre Trump world. Nobody could have anticipated him, but I knew that the director job was a job that came with no power other than um, the power of diplomacy and persuasion.
Mm,
And so OGE had three main points of leverage, so to speak. It didn't have power, but it had leverage. One thing it could do with presidential nominees who needed Senate confirmation was until they would agree to sell off conflicting assets and recuse from certain things, we could hold up their nomination, and
right.
that incentivized them to cooperate with us. And that is probably the one part of OGE's job that functioned fairly well even after I left under Trump. But for most things, the point of leverage was that for a tiny agency, OGE had a great deal of access to the White House and could call up the White House counsel's office anytime somebody in the administration was misbehaving and wasn't coming around to do what we wanted. And they would almost always get a call pretty quickly from the White House, and that'll change your attitude fast. Then the third option was one that members of Congress talked about when OGE was created, and then it came up for reauthorization hearings every 5 years. They talked about, similar to what you said about bearing witness, that OGE could go public with concerns, and that would create public pressure. And in fact, over the years, they asked prior directors about him. One, Steve Potts, who served 2 terms as director for a total of 10 years, talked about how the mere threat that OGE could go public prevented it from ever having to go public. So things changed radically when Trump came in. One of the disappointing features among so many was that prior to the election, we were working with both the Clinton and Trump campaigns, and the Trump campaign brought in a bunch of people who worked for Chris Christie, who were actually really focused on learning how to do things and were serious about producing a good transition. And I was fairly confident the morning after the election that at least we were going to have a smooth transition. And then they fired Chris Christie and almost his entire team, except for one 29-year-old kid who wound up becoming the head of presidential personnel, and then made news for throwing drinking and vaping parties in the presidential personnel office in the White House. So,
that wasn't Papadopoulos, right? There was some other.
No, that was yet another one. But and so it was radio silence for several weeks, and we were freaking out because the transition is like April 15th for accountants for OGE. That's when we are turning over an entire leadership of a government, and the country's vulnerable if there should be. I mean, imagine if we had a pandemic during a transition or
imagine.
Or an attack. Yeah, actually, we did this time.
Yes.
So we were freaking out, and finally got a hold of them after the transition's 10 weeks, and we lost 20 or 30% of it before we even made contact, and another 20% before they even got rolling. And they brought in Don McGahn, who later made himself infamous as Trump's counsel to the president, I've never met anybody more clueless. It makes me wonder about these big law firms where people pay so much money, like $1,100 an hour for their services, because I've never met anybody who knew less about the task he had undertaken. I don't think he even realized there was a transition that he was supposed to run. And in fact, once we got rolling, my team worked really hard. We were working till 11 o'clock, 11:30 at night on New Year's Eve. And Don McGahn was off in Philly playing a gig with his garage band. Because he was just clueless about what was involved.
Which is funny. I mean, Don McGahn, by the way, is kind of almost has been the moral compass of some of the worst Trump impulses. I believe that's been McGahn, right? Who's been I think
he gets some false good press for that.
Yeah.
Because you know what he is? He's if you ever watched the super old show, Leave It to Beaver, he's the Eddie Haskell kid who encourages everybody else on the playground to misbehave. And then the teacher comes out and he's like, oh, not me. Because he's a lawyer and he knows, unlike
he knows
the Trump
how to
people,
spin it
that
in his
he
favor.
could go to jail if he did the things they wanted. And it's not that he thought they were bad. He thought, I don't want to go to jail. And so he kept himself on the right side of the law. But boy, have things gone wrong when that's the standard for being the good guy in an administration, not a criminal. Congratulations. Here's your medal.
So you did speak out. You utilized the ability to speak out as director of OGE. And what caused you finally to do so? I mean, from the beginning, I guess the transition, briefly, what is supposed to happen? What are they supposed to turn over to you?
So, during a transition, we're supposed to work with presidential nominees at the Office of Government Ethics and turn over about 900 of the top positions, including Department of Defense Secretary and Secretary of State, and work with them on their financial disclosures, which, these guys are always rich, unfortunately. And so it takes weeks to go through their disclosures and then negotiate ethics agreements. And in the Trump administration in particular, they fought us all the way. Why should I have to sell this? Why is that a conflict? And that
Or a
really,
public or a trust, right? Isn't that the idea? You freeze
yeah,
your
although
assets?
that's a whole other story. There are currently 0 blind trusts in the executive branch, and there haven't been any since Henry Paulson, Treasury Secretary, created one in 2006.
I
So,
remember.
suffice to say, the ethics problems are so complex. The things that we often think of as solving them don't really work.
Right.
Um, but yeah, on January 11th, 2017, he announced that he was not going to be selling after having strung everyone along and saying, I'm going to have no conflicts of interest. And he did that sham news conference with the phony stacks of papers
Yeah.
and folders that were probably blank and certainly had no. I mean, it was like somebody who'd never seen a folder created that prop because they weren't wrinkled, they weren't sticky tabbed, they weren't worn out. And they announced they were setting up their fake blind trust and putting his kids in charge of it. And I just thought, well, that's the last straw. And I had prepared in the worst case scenario to speak and finalized it as he was talking and went and gave a presentation where I talked for 13 minutes about how this guy should divest. And I pretty much figured it was a speaking letter of resignation because I was sure I was going to be fired at noon on January 21st. And the reporters in the room scared the daylights out of me because they were sitting there ignoring me, checking their phones, typing away to each other. And one by one, they start looking up, and one by one, their eyes start getting bigger and they pause. And then all of a sudden, there's this frenzy where they're on the phone and they're typing. And I'm like, oh man, this is going to have consequences for me.
You almost got through it without anyone. Like, keep looking at your phone. Damn it.
And the only reason I think they didn't fire me is because Jason Chaffetz, the head of the oversight committee, went after me and botched it so badly that he then got fried by his constituents in a town hall meeting, scaring the daylights out of him. And all of a sudden, he went from going after me to trying to de-escalate, which I was happy to do, and did what I could to keep the Trump administration honest. But that's like saying move a mountain with a spoon. It wasn't going to happen.
No, I mean, there is no good analogy for this. I'm like
Yeah.
thinking like you're like the person at the bachelor party that's like, no, maybe we shouldn't have strippers and cocaine. And they could not even because that's what's supposed to happen usually. But um yeah, and so you were not you did not resign yet and you were not fired yet
Yeah.
until when?
So, I stayed till July and had some clashes. Kellyanne Conway did her infamous routine where she told everybody to go buy Ivanka stuff, and I tried to get them to reprimand her for that. And I found out that this rumor that they were creating secret ethics waivers in the White House that nobody was privy to. So I went after those. And in late April, I demanded that they release all of them to me, and I gave them till May 30th. I was told that they called over to Saudi Arabia, where he was for some reason, and we assumed it was to ask if he could fire me. But I managed to get Chuck Grassley, of all people, involved, trying to find out, well, what are these secret waivers? And I'm
Yeah.
told he insisted that they release them because, as I quoted in a letter that I sent, he had insisted Obama release his. So on the morning, I truly believe, although I can't prove, that they created all the waivers on the morning of the deadline, and that the secret of the secret waivers is there were no secret waivers. They were just violating the rules.
They just invented it. Yeah,
Because when we got them, they were most of them were unsigned, undated, and the metadata showed that not only the PDF but the MS Word had been created that morning. And who knows? It's possible they were created before, but I don't believe it. In my heart of hearts, I'll always believe they ginned them up that morning because they were out of options. So,
yeah, like everything I do is legal. Yay. Just a little thumbprint, put a little, I don't know, some of the breakfast that you ate.
and
Wipe your mouth on this.
Led me to quit after that was that they adapted. After that, they just cut me off from all information. And I had to certify White House financial disclosure reports. And I felt like if I refused to certify all of them, I look partisan and I look like I'm just trying to undermine Trump. But if I sign off on any of them without knowing what these people are doing for a living and without having answers to questions about their finances, I am becoming window dressing for corruption. And so
Yeah.
I just felt I was out of options. You know, the whole time I kept checking in with myself because it certainly wasn't any fun. And I went from having a one eye twitch to two eye twitches at the same time, which people say they couldn't see, but it makes you feel like a maniac. Um, and I kept asking myself,
That's just called blinking,
yeah,
Walter.
that's right. Well, I was like this, so it's a little more disturbing. Um, and I asked myself three questions. Number one was, can you do the mission? Number two, can you do it ethically and morally? And number three, can you tell the truth? And all three of those, two of those kept being true all the way to the end. But by July, I realized I couldn't do the first one, do the mission. And OGE was also barred by law from talking to Congress. So I couldn't get
Oh,
Congress
wow.
involved in helping me. Not that I think they would
Well,
have anyways, but my hands
no,
are really tied.
that seems
It's insane.
bizarre that OG. I mean, who would you report to?
So
You're
to
reporting to
talk
the
to
actual
Congress,
executive branch?
yes, so to talk to Congress, I have to talk to the Office of Management and Budget, which is part of the Executive Office of the President, the EOP, which means that Trump would have to give me permission to go and tattle on him to Congress. So, you know, we could answer questions that came from Congress, but we couldn't sit down with them and say, here's the help we need. And I just felt like leaving government, I would be able to, I took a gamble. I thought I'll be able to get a bigger platform outside government than I would have in it, because my time in the sun in the government was fading now that I was losing access to information, and I wouldn't have a platform to oppose what was obviously the most corrupt administration in history. So I left, and I feel like I really did wind up having a bigger platform, and I now work for the past 4 years or so very closely with congressional staff on legislative efforts and things like that to try to bring about the change that I couldn't bring about from within the government. And also
Right.
gave me freedom to adopt a broader definition of government ethics because, you know, in answer to an earlier question about weren't there always problems, the answer is yes, but I felt obligated to stay within the lane of the role that I had agreed to take on in government as leading an office that had a very specific mission. I leave government now, I feel like a lot more things are government ethics than are within OGE's purview. And so that was important to me as well as things were just crumbling.
What's going on, Frantifa? If you haven't already, subscribe to this channel right now. Hit that button. And also, you can become a patron and support the show every single week. Get access to bonus episodes and exclusive merchandise. Patreon.com/bitchuation room. Do